I read Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner of indie pop shoegaze band fame Japanese Breakfast. Michelle Zauner talks about the death of her mom in this book. Her mother is Korean and her father is white. They met in Korea, but her mom gets sick in this book and eventually dies. But then Michelle kind of deals with the death of her mom and realizes how important food is and how her mom kind of was the gateway to Michelle's Korean heritage. So H Mart is this big Korean market, and Michelle talks about going to H Mart and how every time she's there she cries because all of the food she sees reminds her of moments that she shared with her mom. It was really, really beautifully written, and it talks about some super delicious Korean food. So I would really recommend reading Crying in H Mart. It was one of the candidates for One Book, One Lincoln, which is my old public library that I worked at. So it's really highly rated, and I really enjoyed it.
So, Infinite Country by Patricia Engel. It is a very emotional and eventful family saga and immigrant story about one family trying to better their lives and their yearning for the American dream. It stretches over 20 years, but it's all packed into 191 pages, so it moves really quickly. The story really opens with the daughter of the family, 15-year-old Talia. She just broke out of a nun-managed reform school in Colombia in the mountains, and she's racing back to Bogota so she can get on a plane and reunite with her family in the United States. From there, the narrative switches between herself, her mom, her dad, and it goes over their family history and their whole situation of their family emigrating from Bogota to the United States, where they originally had visas, and they become undocumented immigrants because they can't reapply, and so they make the decision to live here as undocumented immigrants instead of going back to war-torn Bogota. And so it's really about the American dream and this one family and their struggle trying to just live happy, wholesome lives. What I really appreciated about this book is that it addresses immigration issues in a way that doesn't feel antagonistic or preachy, while it's being really empathetic in the portrayal of the immigrant experience. So it was great for me.
So the favorite book that I read first in 2021 was Frederick Bachman's Anxious People. When you work in a library or known for being a reader, people will stop you everywhere and tell you what their favorite book was, the one that you must read. I have to say that I'd kind of stopped reading Richard Bachman books if you've read some of his other stuff. It's nice and it's very cozy, but they're kind of formulaic. I read The Man Called Ove. I read My Grandma Told Me to Tell You She's Sorry. And I liked them. They were warm, cuddly books, but I felt like I've read what you can offer Frederick Bachman. This book is completely different. It's like an onion. Layers come off. The layers of humanity, the layers of all of our emotions, the layers of how we make decisions in a moment. The characters are wonderfully defined. You get into, you're introduced to the story because there was a break-in and they're looking for the robber. And you end with this beautiful story of redemption and friendship and loneliness and humanity. One of the best books I probably read ever, and definitely for 2021.
My favorite book that I read this year was House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. It's a really creepy horror YA novel. I would definitely recommend it for an older audience or even adult readers of YA because there are some pretty heavy issues and some pretty dark content, but it's such a good story. It's about three sisters who went missing when they were young. They were missing for a month. They have no memory of what happened to them while they were gone, and they just as mysteriously returned. And now it's 10 years later, and the oldest sister has gone missing again. The two younger sisters are pretty sure it has something to do with what happened to them 10 years ago, but they're not sure, and how can they find their sister if they have no memories? But there's also creepy fairy tale aspects to it. I definitely got some Stranger Things vibes from the book, and the cover is just gorgeous. I highly recommend this one.
Next book I'd like to talk about is Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Silvia Moreno Garcia has been on a tear recently and gained a lot of notoriety for playing with genre and putting kind of a Mexican spin on it. Her last book was Mexican Gothic, came out last year, was a huge hit. And before we actually talk about the book, I have to talk about the cover, which I'm going to cut to right now. Look at that thing. How cool is that? So if you couldn't tell by this amazing cover, I know we're not supposed to judge books by our cover, but this one you really should because it sums up the feel of this novel wonderfully. This is a noir set in 1970s Mexico City. Mexico City at this time was embroiled in political upheaval from leftist student protests. You had the CIA working inside Mexico against the student protesters. You had Russian agents. You had horrible abuses from the Mexican government in putting down these student protests. And in the middle of this is a 30-year-old secretary named Maite, who leads a very uninteresting life and likes to escape into fantasy of Western pop music and romance comics. Then one day, her neighbor, who is kind of a young artist who's vaguely connected to some of the leftist political groups, disappears. And she starts following the trail to figure out what happened to her. At the same time, she is being followed by a young, charismatic, somewhat reluctant criminal named Elvis, who has been charged with following her to see if she knows anything about her neighbor's disappearance. Like all great noirs, it's really not about who done it or how it was done. It's about the characters in the novel. Although I will say there's some great whodunit in it. Again, if you're looking for a kind of a twisty, turny take on the noir, set in a time period that I would say I knew very little about and doesn't really get written about a whole lot, at least not in American literature, 1970s Mexico, I would definitely check out Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia.
One of the books that I had the pleasure of reading this summer was a poetry book titled What Kind of Woman by Kate Baer. I'm very drawn to poetry, and this one drew me in because it talks about what it is to be a woman in the 21st century and what that means and the pressures that are put upon women like myself from society, from your friends, family. You know, what people think you're supposed to be doing versus what you want to do and how you want to live your life. It's very interesting from her perspective as a mother, and I'd highly recommend it.
If you're active on Twitter or listen to podcasts, you might recognize the name Ashley C. Ford, author of the memoir Somebody's Daughter. Ford is the former host of the Chronicles of Now podcast, co-host of the HBO companion podcast Lovecraft Country Radio, and MasterCard's Fortune Favors the Bold. She's done video interview series with BuzzFeed News and written for numerous magazines. Her buzzy first memoir, Somebody's Daughter, was an Oprah book and hailed by Glennon Doyle, Brene Brown, and numerous reviewers in newspapers and magazines. John Green says of Somebody's Daughter, it's a retchingly brilliant memoir, a classic in the making. With precise clarity and memory, Ford allows the reader into her childhood and adolescence, which were defined by the looming absence of her incarcerated father. And through that longed-for relationship, you get a clearer picture of Ford's other familiar bonds, like her fraught relationship with her abusive and loving mother, her intense closeness with her overly critical grandmother. Ford grows up before the reader's eyes. We see her handle the revelation of the crime her father was incarcerated for, her first early relationship, which ends in a violent rape. We see her inner struggling relationship with her body. Ford's memoir is an example of the duality of all things in life, love and cruelty, crime and forgiveness. Her life is both ordinary and extraordinary, and it's certainly one of the best memoirs of 2021.
In Brood by Jackie Polson, we get a unique mix of the mundane and the poignant, as a husband and wife try to keep a brood of chickens alive throughout a year in Minnesota. So they face a lot of different challenges, some of them physical, predators, harsh Minnesota winters, some of them familial, like mothers, interfering mothers, and also some existential challenges too, like the trauma that our narrator is undergoing, and she kind of works through as she takes care of the chickens. And I'm not going to spoil it for you because it's a pretty key plot point. But I was just so surprised at how much wit and wisdom could be packed and told through the caretaking of chickens. Polzin just does a really good job of connecting that sort of mundane, everyday maintenance of just keeping 4 chickens alive with really insightful comments kind of about life and the human condition. So this one is really unique and a really wonderful read.
I read Notes on Grief by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and it was this really, really teeny short book. I think it's like 88 pages, but it's super powerful. So the author's father died in 2020, not of COVID, but of something else, in Nigeria. And that kind of derailed the funeral and traveling to see her family. But it's a really beautifully written, small, powerful book. Death is something that we all deal with throughout our lives. It's a universal thing, but it's also really hard to talk about. So I really appreciated this book because it put words to something that was so powerful and hard to talk about. And I really recommend it, especially if you're dealing with something yourself, but also just any time.
3 books. My first 2 actually, are Star Wars books. There's a new Star Wars era that they've started this year called The High Republic, and the first 2 adult novels, there's kids novels and graphic novels and all types of stuff, but the first 2 novels came out this year, and they're both really cool. The first one's called Light of the Jedi, and it's by Charles Soule. The second one is called The Rising Storm, and it's by Cavan Scott. I'm talking about them together because it's kind of one storyline, very brief pause in the middle. But it's nice because it's a bunch of new Jedi, new lightsabers, new stuff that you haven't seen before, but kind of in the same universe that everyone kind of knows. It's set about 400 years before the Star Wars everyone knows, can recognize, but it's similar in a lot of ways, so you know where you are in the universe, but at the same time, it's a new set of rules, new villains, new fighting styles, all types of new stuff. So it's neat to kind of see everything kind of reset a little bit and back up a little bit before they have all the struggles that everyone has known since 1977. So those are both really fun, and there's another one coming out. I think it's in January, but we'll have to check on that one.
If you've been watching any of the Anytime book clubs or any place else where I've been talking about reading for Oshkosh Public Library, you've heard me talk about David Duchovny. David Duchovny has now written his 5th book, Truly Like Lightning. His first book, Holy Cow, is a hilarious satire on religion. He also wrote Bleepin' Bobby Dent, Miss Subways, and the 4th one you're going to have to look up on your own because I can't remember it. Truly Like Lightning, though, is him at his prime. He's talking about religion and pop culture and history, and he's putting it all together in a story that is going to propel you through Mormonism, public education, the desert, polygamy, fighting, cowboys, and old movies. So if you like a story that is fully told, where you're going to be questioning yourself and you're going to be questioning the process of the story, Truly Like Lightning is going to make you want to read all the other David Duchovny books.
So the book that I read for 2020 that I chose to talk about today is Death Washes Ashore. It's by Wisconsin author Patricia Skalka, and it's part of the Dave Kubiak Door County Mysteries, and this is the 6th one in the series. And having read the other 5, I would have to say that this one is the best written one so far. So the story starts out with the main character is the sheriff in Door County, and that's one of the really neat things about this series is it's all set in Door County, so there's a lot of cities and roads and places that you might be familiar with if you've ever visited Door County. So that makes it a lot of fun to read. But so the main character is a guy who was a homicide detective in Chicago. He moves to Door County as a park ranger, then he becomes the sheriff. And the story starts out that they've just had a 36-hour storm, just ravished the area. Trees are down, electricity is out, and a body shows up on the beach underneath a boat. And initially they can just see the hand, and then when they lift the boat off, not only is the person dead, but mysteriously he is wearing a suit of armor for some reason. Possible suspects is quite long. In addition, the character who was killed grew up in Door County. His parents had a resort and at a spring festival when the murder victim was quite young. A girl became paralyzed on one of the rides, and since he's returned to the community now, the father of the girl who was paralyzed has it out for him as well. They all have great motives to kill him, but only one of them did. So you'll get to find out when you get to the end of this book. I highly recommend it. It's Death Washes Ashore by Patricia Skelka.
All right. Outlawed by Anna North. So this one is a bit of a wild one. So it's like The Crucible meets True Grit, or Handmaid's Tale meets Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And it's a feminist alternate history of the Old West. Our main character in this one is Ada, who's a young midwife, and she has to flee her hometown, terrified that she's going to be hung, being accused of being a witch, because she hasn't had a child after 2 years of marriage. So she flees first to a convent, but she's really dissatisfied with the limitations of life there. And then the Mother Superior suggests that she goes into the Wyoming mountains and she joins the Hole in the Wall gang. And so she does that, and the gang is led by the enigmatic The Kid. And these notorious outlaws end up being nothing like they seem at first notice. And they're actually a band of outcast, queer, or gender nonconforming, or barren people. And so Ada has to decide if she wants to join the gang's dangerous mission to transform the Wild West, or go back into regular society. And so it's really fast-paced and suspenseful, and it's actually really surprisingly educational when it comes to Ada's knowledge of midwifery and the real outlaw history in Wyoming. But it still creates this totally alternative history, and it addresses our current state with LGBTQ rights and gender nonconformity. So I really enjoyed it. All right.
I read Fox and I by Catherine Raven, which is it's a memoir of a wildlife biologist who lives in some unnamed part of Montana. She teaches classes, so that's basically the only interaction she has with people, and that's by design. So she's able to really beautifully describe her surroundings and the landscape and just the life that is on her property, non-human life. And there's this fox that comes to her house, and at first she's kind of confused by it, but then eventually she realizes that this fox is coming the same time every day, and so she goes out to meet it and starts reading a book to it, and she has this relationship with this fox, and it's really beautiful and unusual. It was kind of hard for her to come to terms with the relationship at first because as a wildlife biologist, she wanted to leave the wildlife alone. And you're not supposed to be friends with a fox. But she kind of got over that and appreciated and respected the relationship for what it was. And it's just really, really beautifully written and such a cool description of this spectacular relationship between her and a fox. I really recommend it.
Another book I had the pleasure of reading this year was a second book to young Pueblo's first book, which was Inward. His second book, titled Clarity and Connection. His first book is a lot about how we look at ourselves inwardly and how we treat ourselves and how that affects how we treat everybody else and all the things that measure that into society and how that works out. So in his new book, Clarity Connection, that did come out this year, it's about how we can take that second step. You've looked inward, now how can you connect that to others around you and better yourself? And he does that through poetry and verse and some essays.
The other book I want to talk about is Later by Stephen King. If you've ever read It by Stephen King, you will recognize some of the cool horror stuff that goes on in this book. I really liked it. It's short, it's sweet, it's really quick, easy read. The only disappointing thing I found was it really kind of fell flat the last 3 pages for me, but besides that, it was really fun. Kind of very Stephen King and weird and a little gory and a little, horror-stricken, but it was a lot of fun as well. So if you wanted something quick for end of the year, kind of spooky time, that would be fun.
I want to tell you that Amber Ruffin is one of the few authors and comedians who can make stories about racism funny. And she demonstrates that in her and her sister's anecdotal book, You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey, Crazy Stories About Racism. Ruffin is a writer and performer on Late Night with Seth Meyers and the host of The Amber Ruffin Show. And she pairs up with her sister, Lacey Lamar, to write this hilarious but sobering look at the casual and not-so-casual assaults, comments, and assumptions Lacey and Amber have to handle on a daily basis just because of their race. Ruffin starts off the book, My sister Lacey is the lightning rod for hilarious racist stories. She's the perfect mix of polite, beautiful, tiny, and black, which makes people think they can say, hey, I can say whatever I want to this person. Which makes people think, I can say whatever I want to this woman. And I guess you can. Hey, knock yourself out, but that doesn't mean you won't end up in a book. And from there, Amber and Lacey trade anecdotes about being mistaken for Harriet Tubman, being accused of stealing from stores they weren't in, having strangers place their whole hands in their hair, having police threaten them because they were skipping. As actress Busy Phillips says, the message of this book is for all of us, no matter why you're here. Perhaps you're a fan of Amber Ruffin's comedy, or a Seth Meyers fan, or a personal friend of Lacey's, or maybe you're just a person browsing for a book that will help you understand the Black experience in America, and the other ones seem too much like school. These stories are delivered with the humor and horror they deserve. You will laugh, you will be enraged, and if you're a white person, you will understand more than you did about the truth of being Black in America. Even if you understood a lot through those more academic books, You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey is the perfect balance for any reader to get an insight into what it means to be Black in America.
In Fuzz, When Nature Breaks the Law by Mary Roach, we get a wide-ranging view of what happens when people and animals collide, when animals break rules that are meant for people. Roach has been writing about science in interesting and fun ways for a long time, and this newest book of hers is no exception to her success with that. It's so interesting as she takes a look at lethal legumes, murderous trees, breaking and entering animals. There's just so many interesting ways that nature ends up butting heads with people. But what it all really boils down to, and she kind of gets there, is that really humans are the ones who have to adjust their expectations. So you'll laugh, you'll definitely learn something when you read Fuzz by Mary Roach.
What I'd like to talk about is a great memoir that really broke me out of a reading slump I had been in for the first part of the year. It is a memoir entitled Trejo, My Life of Crime, Redemption in Hollywood. It's written by probably one of the most recognizable character actors of the last 30, 40 years, Danny Trejo, and co-written by fellow actor-writer Donnell Logue. He grew up in the 1950s Los Angeles and basically was raised to be a gangster his entire life. He was a drug addict by his early teens, and as an early teenager, he was already in and out of prisons. By the time he was a young adult in his early 20s, he had already been serving time in some of the most notorious prisons in California, including Folsom and San Quentin. During a prison riot in the mid-1960s, he decided he didn't want to die a drug addict in prison. He turned his life around, got out, and kind of started the second part of his life, coaching other addicts and ex-cons and really devoted his life to helping people in recovery. His life took a very strange turn kind of midway through it in his 40s, where he was discovered by the director of a film called Runaway Train, starring Jon Voight, where he was cast as, unsurprisingly, a convict boxer. Went on to star in dozens, if not hundreds, of films. If you check out his IMDb, he has done films such as From Dusk Till Dawn, Heat, Machete, Spy Kids films, Con Air. Dude has led like 4 or 5 lives in one. His most recent act involved becoming a restaurateur and starting a chain of restaurants called Trejo's Tacos. Trejo, My Life of Crime, Redemption, and Hollywood. It's my memoir pick of the year.
One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. Okay, so our main character, August Landry, she's just moved to New York. She's 23 years old. She doesn't have that many personal belongings as a personal choice, but she comes with a lot of emotional baggage instead. We learn that she spent most of her childhood basically acting as the assistant to her amateur sleuth mother, who's like really digging into their family history and trying to find her long-lost brother. And so August was left to raise herself, essentially. And so she's like been alone most of her life, and she's clearly bitter and jaded about it. And so she's really hoping to kind of keep to herself and figure out her own life for the first time she's had the opportunity to when she moves to New York. But this is a rom-com, so she doesn't have that opportunity when she moves in with this really eclectic, endearing, and nosy group of roommates in New York City, and they quickly become her family. And they kind of slowly reveal this like near real-life magic of New York City. And then we're fully brought into that magic when August falls in love almost at first sight with this punk rocker girl who also commutes on the same train line as her. And then we come to realize that she's a time traveler from the 1970s and her soul is connected to the train somehow, and it's a mystery of how to free her from it. And so this whole story was kind of just like a book hug that I really wanted this year. It was just like a couple of steamy scenes from a rom-com, and it came with like the same comfort of knowing that there will be a happy ending, even though there's a little bit of a supernatural twist. Even like there's a couple of mysteries that intertwine the whole novel together, and all of these secondary characters kind of pulls it together. And the pacing of the story cycles through like fast and slow and medium all the way through, but it's really compelling because you care about those secondary cast of characters. And I'm absolutely obsessed with Ada's roommates, and if I ever had to live with roommates again, I would want to live with them.